Now, another important metric is trauma literacy in a relationship. And I'm just going to say that one of the best steps that you can take today, if you haven't done so, is to read this book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And this was my eye-opener after trying just about everything I possibly could to really learning, how to navigate around these difficult to articulate physiological and emotional phenomena. Now, what does trauma literacy do? Well, first of all, it's important to understand that 90% of the American public are going to exhibit trauma symptoms and trauma coping mechanisms that are destructive for the relationship. They're destructive. Now, most of us are not going to recognize and say, oh, that's a trauma symptom, because we're trauma illiterate. Now, trauma symptoms break into 4 basic categories. Well, there's actually a little more. So you have fight. Now, this is someone who, when they approach certain terrain, they become highly combative and aggressive irrationally. So that's a trauma symptom. It's fight. It means their reptilian brainstem is being activated with the perception that their life is in jeopardy, in danger in some way. So they start fighting irrationally. Now, the next is freeze. When someone freezes, for example, when a man asks a woman, I find you really attractive and I'd love to be sexual with you, and they're alone together and she freezes. This is a symptom of trauma. She's experienced some violation that threatened her life, or that she perceived threatened her life. And she didn't have the conscious relationship training, who does in our country, in order to navigate that well. So she froze, and maybe she was raped, maybe whatever happened. And that never got dealt with in a culture that doesn't like dealing with its shadow. And so there's nothing wrong with the invitation. The person has no interest in raping them. There's a beautiful woman. There's a lot of, wonderful magnetic energy. Oh, you're so beautiful. I'd love to be sexual with you, and I want to talk about doing that in a way that's respectful, and there's this freezing and these darting eyes. Well, that's a trauma symptom. If you understand the freeze pattern, you now know you're not dealing with an adult, you're not dealing with a human being, you're dealing with a regressed, traumatized reptile. You're dealing with the reptilian brainstem, and you have no business being sexual in that domain. Now, if you're conscious and you see that, and you actually care about the person as opposed to being happily willing to traumatize them again in order to experience a power play or reenact some sexual abuse, if you care about them, the response could be something like, first of all, I've changed my mind. Let's take that off the table. Because I'd never want to do that in a way that didn't bring you happiness. Well, just saying that might release the freeze. You have to watch the face, since we're dealing with a trauma-illiterate culture, so she's not going to tell you, I feel scared like a frozen deer in the headlights, and I have no idea why, and I feel crazy. And she's not going to tell you that, because in this culture she gets punished for doing so, which means you need to be the one that says, okay, I see that. Let's take that off the table. In your own mind, get rid of the whole idea of it being a romantic evening. You can excuse yourself if you're really not able and willing to show up, but if you want to grow the relationship, then a thing to do, and it's frankly good to do it before doing this, meaning that is not, in this culture, a very respectful way to begin a relationship. It's way more respectful than groping someone and the kind of stuff that goes on all the time, but it's not a very respectful thing. A much more respectful thing to do would be to say, at least from my perspective, it looks like the relationship could go in a romantic direction. I have some romantic feelings, and I want to know if you feel safe and comfortable to talk about any of that. Is that too much? And you do it from a little bit of a physical distance and in a neutral tone, and so that they really have space, and you watch their body. And if the answer is yes, or affirmative, it becomes important to talk about some of the abuse history, to perhaps say, well, I found it very useful to read The Body Keeps the Score. I've no interest in something, fast and dirty with you. I want something that's meaningful. And, it's a very difficult culture that we have in around this. And yes, there's a lot of adrenaline, quick sex, and you may know, and, how to participate in that. But to have a real friendship that, grows, that's quite an accomplishment, because this culture is not conducive to that. So it's actually a real accomplishment for two people to leave the culture and to create something unique on their own. And so you go into it, and you can go through a traumatic history. I'd like to go through a traumatic history. These are the things where I've gone into fight, freeze. These are the things I'm terrified of being shamed about. These are the things I don't understand. I'm really scared anytime this happens, so I just run away. You can talk about, and that goes back to that safe emotional container. But anytime you see freeze in someone, anytime you see that irrational aggression, anytime you have someone run away, where you ask them a question and they say, oh, I'll get back to you, and they have a fear in their eye, and then they just go to the other side of the street, they don't return your text, they're running. They're in fight, freeze, or, fight, freeze, or flight. So you've got these things to look out for, and what you're looking for is irrational, overwhelming behavior and body symptoms. You've also got dissociation. The person doesn't seem to be in their body. Or you ask them, or you notice yourself. For example, if I check in right now, there's about 30% I'm in my body, and there's a certain amount that I'm not. So we know that I'm dealing in traumatic terrain. Now, why exactly we're dealing with that might unfold if we had a conversation. And so if we understand dissociation, fight, flight, freeze are the first obvious, and these can show up in the body and in behavior. But there's another one that's very important to keep an eye out, and this is irrational secrecy, taboos, and denial. This tells you you're in traumatic terrain also. When someone lies, it means they don't feel safe to tell the truth. Now, there's a couple of different reasons. They may want to manipulate, use, abuse you, etc., and that could be one reason. But if someone loves you and is trying to build a relationship, and you get into this one terrain of the conversation, and they start, no, that's not happening, no, and getting anxious. What they're saying is that the physiological symptoms that's bringing up are not comfortable for them. They don't know how to deal with it. And this is very important to understand, that you need help to deal with trauma. And so I would say that if you haven't spent a good 50 hours investing in trauma literacy, so what does that mean? Spending some time with 2 or 3 trauma therapists to see if there's a good fit. Reading The Body Keeps the Score, maybe reading some of Gabor Mate's work on addiction, like in the realm of Hungry Ghosts. Now, addiction is another symptom. If you are dealing with addiction, you are dealing with trauma. Addiction is a coping mechanism for pain that is beyond the conscious mind's ability to deal with on its own, and so it would rather attack part of the self to suppress it than face it alone. So we've now got 6 different symptoms: addiction, secrecy, dissociation, fight, flight, freeze. And the answer is 50 or more hours of investment in trauma literacy. So reading The Body Keeps the Score, that could take 20 hours or so in an Audible book. Spending 3 or 4 hours with a couple, at least 2 different trauma therapists, doing some EMDR work, understanding the language, practicing talking with it, possibly practicing with someone else, a trauma buddy. This can create healing and support and awareness such that these symptoms are not the enemy, but rather a doorway into, would you like to go to a trauma therapist together? Would you like to do an EMDR session around this topic before we talk more about it? Would you like to do a family constellation therapy so that we bring in all the different people in the space around this? And so this is intelligent development of a fluency around vocabulary and energy that is absolutely necessary if you are to avoid abusing someone in the most sensitive areas. Because if you misread these cues or violate and abuse these terrains, you've shot the relationship. It means it will be a deteriorating, destructive relationship, or it will end because it is a deteriorating and destructive relationship. And you only have about 3 chances with trauma. If you traumatize someone 2 or 3 times, you don't know what you're doing and you don't repair that, you've made it unsafe. Now, if they're desperate and dependent and clinging to you because they're even more unsafe on their own, the relationship may last, but a good relationship won't last. And so it's very vital to get this piece of trauma awareness. And as I said, it takes about 50 hours and, I don't know, an average of $1,000 in treatment to just get familiar with the terrain. If it's proving very fruitful, it may be something that you want to do further. And as part of that terrain, spending a good 70 hours or more in exploring psychedelics, microdosing, etc., if you have PTSD, etc., could be an important part. Again, it's a very important thing to explore thoroughly before going into that terrain. All right, I will see you in just a moment on the next metric.